Noswaith dda i chi, croeso cynnes i chi yma i webinar cyswllt ffermio ar mastitis mewn defaid. Good evening to you all and a very warm welcome for joining us tonight, Farming Connect webinar on sheep mastitis and looking at the latest findings from a Farming Connect project and an APHA project. Fy enw yw Menna Williams a fi fydd yn cadeirio'r webinar yma heno. My name is Menna Williams and I will be chairing this evening. Hopefully everything will run smoothly. Just nodyn bach sydyn i weid, fydd rhan gweddill y webinar heno drwy gyfrwng y Saesneg yn unig, jyst gan bod y siaradwyr gwadd yn unia Saesneg, ond mae croeso chi ofyn unrhyw gwestiwn trwy'r Gymraeg a fy nhw'n ngorau ateb nhw gyd cyn diwedd y noson. You're welcome to ask any questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and get through them all before the end of the webinar. You're welcome to ask them as we go along during the evening through the medium of English or Welsh. And please we are welcoming all questions. It's the best way to make these webinars as interactive as possible. So, tonight's webinar, the topic is on sheep mastitis, and we are welcoming Kate Phillips from Flock Health, who has been working with Farming Connect discussion group members to gather comprehensive data on mastitis incidents, identifying the causative bacteria and investigating the possible links between farm-level factors and disease occurrence. We are also joined by two farmers who have been part of the project Kate has been leading, and we will hear their experience a little later on. We're also lucky to have individual staff members from Animal Health and Plant Agency, having undertaken a EU mastitis project during the 2023-2024 lambing season, and we'll have Rachel Collins who will provide a summary of their findings during tonight's webinar. So without further ado, I'll ask Kate to share her screen. So I'll take, so if we can take down our screen, and then Kate will now share her screen from Flock Health, and she will take over tonight's webinar then. Lovely, thanks Kate. Well, if you just turn your mic on then, Kate, and then we can get started with the webinar.
That might help.
There we are, we can hear you now. And if you want to turn your PowerPoint onto mode, yeah, that would be fab.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Menna. Sorry about that.
No, thank you, Kate. No, it's fine. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm here just to tell you about a project that I got started with my Montgomeryshire discussion group. This discussion group is funded by Farming Connect, and we have a series of those that we're working with through Flock Health. And I asked the group of farmers what they wanted to do a project on, because Farming Connect were providing funding for interesting projects, and I went through quite a few subjects with them, and resoundingly quite a few members of the group said they had a problem with mastitis and they'd really like to learn a bit more about it. So hence we got going. So the aim of the project was really to gain a better understanding of the factors that affect the incidence of mastitis, and hopefully to develop some strategies to improve the management of mastitis and to reduce culling from that disease. So what I asked farmers to do was provide details of their flock and general management for 2023. So they had to rack their brains and come up with the sort of what they estimated to be how many cases they had in 2023 and various aspects of their management surrounding those cases. And I also asked them to do that for 2024. In 2024, I also asked them for an awful lot of detail about individual cases of mastitis as they happened through the 2024 lambing season. And We also were sending samples of milk from mastitic udders to APHA for culture of the bacteria and to see if any of the bacteria were resistant to the range of antibiotics that were being used by the farmers. So just to give a bit of background about mastitis, interestingly, there's been estimates to say that the UK sheep industry loses something like £120 million a year in direct and indirect costs, and it is really ranked as one of the most important diseases affecting ewes. You know, we've got to think about the impact in terms of poor milk yield, poor growth rate, higher culling rates, and higher ewe and lamb mortality. So it really does have a huge impact on the bottom line. And in some flocks, you know, we can have as many cases as 25% of certain groups. And certainly I've seen that myself in groups of yearling ewes. One particular farm springs to mind when it was the beast from the east year, which was horrendous. And certainly one group of yearlings I was involved in had more than 25% of them which were affected by mastitis, which is probably the greatest loss when you're losing a yearling in its first lactation. There's been quite a few studies over the years, nothing particularly recently, but nothing that's really found a sort of solution for us all to manage mastitis better. Study of Grant showed there were 2 to 3% of ewes in 10 flocks had acute mastitis, but one of the flocks had up to 37% of their ewes with mastitis, which is a horrendous number. The work of Smith suggested that they'd isolated 37 species of bacteria from 14 udders, and the most common bacteria they found was Staphylococcus aureus, which will tell you the results of what we found with our recent studies. And Cooper did a survey of 329 flocks, and they concluded that udder conformation, so how the teats were, teat placement, and litter size, so that ewes having more lambs are more likely to have mastitis. Nutrition, certainly when I've looked at that, if we're feeding our ewes well and meeting their nutritional requirements properly, then we're less likely to get mastitis. I'm not saying it's all about nutrition, because I think the lambing environment has a big impact too, keeping everything hygienic and being as careful as we can to keep pens clean and hands clean when we're lambing and stripping teats and the like. A summary of the work can be found in this AHDB publication called Understanding Mastitis in Sheep, and I've pulled out some of the key conclusions from the work. So just to quickly whip through those with you. So on an average, we're looking at cases ranging from 0 to 6.6% per year. So that's a lot of ewes going with mastitis at the higher end. About 4 to 6% of ewes are cold due to other problems. When one ewe has mastitis, that means the bacteria are there and it's a contagious disease, so it's likely to transmit to the next ewe who maybe uses that pen or is close to that other animal. We've already mentioned about feeding. Underfeeding protein and energy can have an impact and increase the risk of mastitis. Ewes in poor body condition also seem to be more prone to mastitis too. Poor hygiene, we've mentioned that. Obviously, if we've got a poor environment, damp environment, dirty environment, the bacteria will multiply, and which increases the chances of infection. So good udder conformation, good idea, but it's very hard to be selecting on udder conformation in new lambs, certainly. But I guess if we've got the genetic information and their mother and grandmother maybe had good udder conformation, we might be able to select that way. Yeah, 2 or more lambs. I think we know that lambs are tugging at the ewe, maybe hungry lambs, maybe potentially damaging teats, and more likely to allow bacteria into the udder. The longer ewes and lambs stay indoors, the more risk we have of mastitis because of the buildup of bacteria. It's best to leave ewes and lambs in the same area before, during, and after lambing, so they're not challenged by unfamiliar bacteria. That's something, you know, we wouldn't necessarily think about. we have a fair amount of knowledge, but we still don't have an effective control strategy, really. You know, some people can reduce their levels, but some years are worse than others, and we do think the weather has a significant influence on that. Recommended treatment for mastitis is injectable antibiotics and preferably an anti-inflammatory medicine to give pain relief, and that's as soon as possible after the mastitis has been recognised. There is one vaccine available, and I'll let Fiona talk about that in a little while to give a better picture of how we could use that. So I'm now going to hand over to Rachel Collins from the APHA at Starcross, who actually has been running a another project alongside our project, and we were just very fortunate that we got our project going, and then we found a message that had been sent out to all vets saying that there was a Suckler U mastitis project being run by APHA at the same time. So we were very fortunate to be running alongside the samples that were being sent into APHA from other farmers across the country. So I'm going to hand over to Rachel now.
Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you, Rachel.
Perfect. So yes, as Kate said, I am a veterinary investigation officer who works down in APHA Starcross, and I'm a member of the small ruminant expert group within APHA, and we decided to come up with this Suckler U mastitis project because there's very sparse information in the literature, and we just really wanted to have a look to see about what was happening in the ewes in this country. So next slide, please, Kate. So a bit of a background, as I say, it was undertaken by the APHA Small Ruminant Expert Group during the 2024 lambing season, and farms could submit up to 3 samples from each lambing cohort of ewes or ewe lambs throughout the lambing season. So all the testing was fully subsidised, so we have to say thank you very much to the DEFRA Endemic Disease Surveillance Budget, who have paid for all of the bacterial cultures, identification and sensitivity testing of all of the isolates that we've identified. Next, please, slide, please, Kate. So what were the aims of our project? So we, as I said, we really wanted to improve the surveillance of the bacteria causing mastitis in suckler ewes. There's quite a lot of information out there in dairy ewes, not so much in suckler ewes. So we really wanted to just have a bit of a look-see. And what we wanted to do was find out if our findings were similar to what had been previously reported. We also wanted to find out about the antimicrobial resistance data of the bacteria that are isolated, and that's very important now to have knowledge on this resistance data for the role that both vets and farmers play in antimicrobial stewardship. There has been suggestions that potentially certain mycoplasma organisms might play a role in mastitis, and I don't think anyone had really looked into that before. So all of our samples got screened for mycoplasma organisms, so mycoplasmas that are endemic in this country already. So Mycoplasma oviPneumoniae was the one that we were interested in, which most typically causes pneumonia in ewes and lambs. But also it was very important for us to provide surveillance for contagious agalactiae. So that is caused by an exotic mycoplasma species that is notifiable in this country, which we are constantly doing surveillance for because we need to continue to prove disease freedom, which is really important for international trade purposes. Next slide, please. So just a very brief overview of the samples that we submitted. So we're in the southwest, so our sort of lambing season tends to start in December. So we rolled over into December 2023 and received samples all the way into August 2024. We had 42 submissions in total, and that also includes Kate's samples. In total, we cultured 120 milk samples and identified 24 bacterial species. We didn't detect any mycoplasma organisms at all, which is good news, I think. Next slide, please, Kate. So I've just pulled out what we deem to be the most important bacterial pathogens that we found. As you are probably aware, taking a well, not sterile, but taking a careful milk sample from a suckler ewe is very difficult. So therefore we did get some samples where we probably had contaminant bacteria rather than the pathogenic bugs that cause disease. So I've picked out the ones that that we would deem most important. And as you can see there, our top two organisms that we identified were Mannheimia hemolytica and Staphylococcus aureus. We did find some other Mannheimia species. We've also interestingly potentially found a novel Mannheimia species, so one that's never been previously identified before, and then some coagulase negative staphylococci, so Staphylococcus dromogens was one of the most ones that we saw frequently, and then also a few Streptococcus species. Next slide, please. So looking at the resistance data, I think the positive point that we can see out of all of this is the majority of the isolates, all of the isolates that I've just been speaking about, so Mannheimias and Staph aureus and Streps, were fully sensitive to all the antibiotics that they were tested against. We did have a few which showed either 2 or 3 more resistance patterns, and some that were resistant to 1 antibiotic, which in that case it tended to be tetracycline resistance that we saw was the most single antibiotic that the organisms were resistant to. And that's me done.
Okay, thanks very much, Rachel. Okay, we'll take questions at the end, I think. That's our general plan. So if you've got any for Rachel, hang on to them till later. Thank you. So I'm now going to just tell you a bit more about the project itself and how we got on, really. So initially I had 18 farmers sign up, and 11 were from the Farmer Connect Montgomeryshire discussion group, and 7 from other groups across Wales. So all the farms were in Wales, obviously. All farmers reviewed management and mastitis cases for 2023 for me. And most farmers recorded 2024 cases, and they kept going until September this year, which was great. So I think we started something like March, or even February, actually, some farmers. But what was good, the farmers were allowed to take the sample, which is a fiddly old job, I have to say, trying to keep the contaminants out of the milk sampling tube, and to keep the teats clean, and to do that with a ewe that's in pain is fairly tricky, and some farmers actually did find it all too much, particularly those lambing outside. So it's mostly people who were lambing inside, although quite a few people had samples from outside too, because they were later when ewes were well into lactation. So the farmers were asked to record all sorts of things, so I did ask quite a lot of everybody. They recorded ewe age, body condition score, the weeks post-lambing, teat condition, udder condition, whether ORF was a problem, what they were eating, what they were bedded on. I got all sorts of information. So some people did a fantastic job and gave me all that detail. I didn't get every detail from everybody, but I had a pretty good number of reports coming in. APHA offered 3 free tests, but within the project we offered up to 10 samples, although one of my farmers actually did a sterling job and sent in 13, so that was great, and it added to the volume of data that was useful for APHA anyway. So once samples were gathered and farmers felt that they'd got their 10 or so samples or whatever they managed to collect, they were frozen, but they were then sent off to APHA when suited them, really. Now I'm hoping that Grace Stanhope is out there somewhere. Grace and the Yeomans family were one of the farms involved in the project, and Grace is currently in Canada, and I'm very much hoping she's going to join us in a moment to tell us how she got on, because she was one of my star farmers, very keen, and got several samples for us, and I just hope she's just there somewhere, just going to give me a bit of a background to her farm and how it all went for her in terms of the data recording and the sampling. Grace, are you there?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, perfect.
Great. Okay, fire away, Grace. Thank you.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Grace. I'm currently in Canada, but normally my partner and I live on his family farm in Wales. We lamb about 650 Beulah ewes and ewe lambs. We have a handful of fun other Texels and black ewe lambs and badgers just for the crack, really. We performance record the Beulah flock. Half the ewes will go to a Beulah tup, and about half of them go to a Blueface to cross for mules. We lamb indoors. Our ewes typically, they lamb down, we'll pen them with their lambs in a little individual pen. The next day, the lambs, if they're healthy or tagged, they move into a larger pen with 4 or 5 ewes and lambs together. And then the day after that, they're typically turned out to the field. So they're not indoors for long once they lamb. I did find over the course of taking all our samples that we only had, I think, 2 instances of mastitis in the actual lambing shed, which was really good because it can be pretty crowded. We do have to work pretty hard to try and keep everything clean and sanitized. But we did find it was usually around the 4 to 6 weeks post lambing. And especially when the weather got warmer, like if there was a sudden few warm days, the demand for milk would increase from the lambs. They'd be chomping away on our girls, and we'd end up with a few cases of mastitis. Our biggest challenge, I think, for collecting the samples was that because most of our samples were out in the fields, it took a bit of sort of the first few times you'd find one, you wouldn't have anything to collect with it. And then you really do want to bring the ewe all the way back to the house just to collect a sample, or let her go, come back and try and catch her again later. So the first few we sort of ended up just treating and leaving until I sort of got together a little travel collection kit to take with us wherever we went if we found some. And we did find it sort of happened fairly steadily throughout the year. There was only, for about a week, we had a case every second day pretty much in one of our fields with one group of ewes. So that sort of was a little bit stressful. And because of sort of the weather and we didn't have a load of grass, we had to push back sort of moving them from that field for another few days. And then we did find once we moved them out of that field that the overall instances of mastitis we were getting in that particular group reduced. So I think for next year, if that happens again, try and move them straight away if we can. But other than that, yeah, we just had a normal-ish lambing for us, I suppose.
Okay, well, thank you, Grace. That's really useful because I say you really took a lot of trouble to get those samples for me. And, you know, we've got some really good data from your farm. So that's really helpful. And I know it's tricky trying to get a clean sample from you, particularly outside. So thank you very much. Great. Thanks, Grace. Glad
You're
it
very
worked.
welcome.
Okay, thank you. And now I'm just going to go to Helen Roberts, who was another. Helen and Clive Roberts also were part of the project. And I just want Helen, I'm going to invite Helen just to tell us about her experiences of the project and the farm that they're on near Oswestry. So Helen, can you have a quick description of how you got on with everything, please?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Kate. There's a few farm facts there on the slide there. As you can see, we're about roughly 170 acres and 440 commercial sheep. And then we have the small flock of blue-faced Beltecs and Chamois. They're all lambed around sort of February time and do sort of lamb in. The commercials are all lambed out, including the triplets, from April onwards. And with the pedigree flock, I don't think we had any of those with mastitis, not until the very end, when one of the blueface probably lambing at the end of March, and that was probably down to the weather, and she was a yearling ewe. But she would be the only one on the indoor lambing ones where we had a sample from, and then all the rest of our samples came from our commercial flock, mainly yearling ewes, 2-year-old ewes. And as Grace has just alluded to, trying to collect the samples outdoors isn't always easy. We would perhaps try and bring them in to give them that initial jab and just sort of see what they're doing and to see how it affects the lambs. Because very often if they're twins, you're going to get, and the ew's going to lose a quarter. We'll end up bringing, one of those lambs in and putting it on the milk machine or adopting it. I have made a mistake on the farm fact there, because I have just asked Clive, we're 1,100 foot in the yard and go up to 1,300 foot. So yeah, that snowy picture there, which was took a couple of years ago, is what the farm can look like, and it can even look like that in April. But I think I prefer to see that sort of weather than the spring that we've had this year, because trying to find clean pasture to put the ewes out on when they'd lambed, or moving them from lambing fields into other pastures, was probably our biggest problem. And that probably, I would have said, added to the amount of mastitis cases that we had this year. Because although we only sent in 8 samples, Kate, we did probably have more, and it was just time and effort. It is just me and Clive that does 99% of the lambing sort of thing. So yeah, that's about sort of sums us up really. We do what we can, and we found the project really interesting. And if there is some way of getting a cure for this disease, or reducing our losses, that's what we're all looking for. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Helen. That's great. Thanks very much to Helen, Clive, and Grace, and Tom, and John, and Sarah for putting the effort in to get these samples. That's been brilliant. You've been done sterling work. Thank you. So that's great. So I guess most people had trouble, like you, Helen, with the very wet spring and the weather we had. It was conducive to mastitis, unfortunately. It was probably one of those bad years, and 1 or 2 of the members of the group did have a bit of a nightmare with the number of cases they actually had. So just to give you an idea across the whole of the project, a summary of the 2023 cases, and just to give you an idea, these 18 farmers sent me all this information. So on average, the flock size was 563, and that ranged from a flock of 100 up to a flock of 1,415. So we had the full range of sizes of flock across Wales. The scanning was around 155, but we had the full range again, from a typical hill scanning at 115 to a much more lowland type of scanning at 188. The cases on average per farm were about 19 per farm. It's not very nice to think, if they were yearlings, what that cost is. But the range depended on the farm. But, one person just had 1 sample mastitis case, and another had 55 cases. So that's an enormous loss. So the percent of a flock with mastitis was approaching 4% across the 18 farms that we looked at. And the total of mastitis cases across the 18 farms was somewhere around 350. I asked everybody when the cases were occurring, and as Helen just said, and Grace, the cases were not particularly around lambing time, but they were more the sort of 3 to 6 weeks and onwards, when we seem to find that ewes are at the peak milk yield, and lambs are maybe hungry, and there's maybe not quite enough milk, or the weather's turned against them, and they're hiding under the trees and the hay hedges and not eating, so they're not producing the milk that the lambs need. So you can see in the little graph at the bottom, everybody, that the peak seems to be 6 weeks to weaning, but they're spread fairly, you know, across the whole from day one of lambing right through to just before topping, when lumps are found in the udder. So for 2024, I just give you a roundup now of what we found. 12 farmers submitted samples. As I say, I'm not criticising anybody who didn't manage to, because I know it was a tricky job to get the clean samples, but people have provided information even if they didn't submit some samples. A total of 70 samples, which I think is pretty good. Thank you, those 12 farmers who submitted their samples to APHA. And I've got 117 records. That's sort of quite detailed records of each case that was reported. So this is just to summarise the management information I asked everybody to provide me with. So 86% of the ewes recorded lambed inside. Helen was one of the exceptions, lambing outside. 62% were on upland farms, which comes as no surprise, as this is Wales we're talking about. 26 were on lowland farms, and about 12% were a mixture of lowland and upland. On average, the ewes were housed for 6.6 weeks, from nothing, in Helen and Clive's case, to 10 weeks on 1 or 2 farms. All the ewes were housed on bedded on straw, and straw was used in all small pens on all farms when they were lambing inside. 80% of the ewes recorded were fed silage and concentrates, and 20% of ewes were fed hay and concentrates pre-lambing, and some ewes were at grass, getting either or. So, okay. 78% of this case is reported, that's 78% of the 117, were had twins. Okay, so it does seem to be much more common, and that's in line with other findings. 10% of the ewes with mastitis died, and 90% survived, but were all culled at a significant cost. Half of the lambs were creep fed. So, we might have thought that creep feeding would help the ewe and subsidise her milk production, basically. But that doesn't seem to be the case here, because we've got as many lambs that are being creep fed with mums with mastitis as we've got the ones that aren't being creep fed. I asked farmers to comment about the udder in terms of what it looked like, the teat placement. Was it neat and normal? Were the teats at odd angles? Were very large teats, that sort of thing? And 81% of the udders were normal, considered by the farmers, and 71% of the teats were undamaged. So I was asking farmers about damage, biting by lambs or cracking of teats, and most of them were undamaged, but there was a certain proportion that were damaged and had abrasions. And I asked about ORF too, because often ORF is involved in mastitis cases, because once the ORF is there, you're obviously allowing bacteria to get into the udder. But in 97% of the udders recorded here, there was no sign of ORF. So just to look at when these cases were occurring, it varied from day 1 to 16 weeks in the cases, so with a peak at 1 to 6 weeks. So that's sort of peak lactation period. I looked at age. I asked everybody to record the age of the ewes, but you can see I've got a full spread really, from 1-year-old ewe lambs to yearlings to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8. So the odd 8-year-old ewe was there with mastitis, which maybe relates to body condition score of an old ewe potentially, but we've got the full spread of ages, so nothing really to pull out from the age of the ewes. The weather, I think you'll all be identified with this for this spring. There were a few cases picked up on dry days, a few on wet days, but most of the cases were picked up on wet and cold days, which was very typical for 2024. Just to say about the bacteria that were isolated, this is the APHA doing the analysis of the samples, and you will probably notice this is fairly similar to what Rachel showed you a few minutes ago. Basically, the most common bacteria that was found in these samples was Staphylococcus aureus, which is what the literature would tell us as well. And the next most common was Mannheimia hemolytica, 17% of samples. And we only found 14 different bacteria in the samples that were submitted by my group of farmers. Now I'm going to hand over to Fiona because she's an expert vet, as you all know. So I think she's probably best qualified to talk about the sensitivity to the antibiotics. So Fiona, would you mind jumping in here, please?
Yeah, indeed. Thanks, Kate. So we, exactly as Kate's samples show, the most common Mastitis bacteria is often Staph aureus, but we are, especially in suckling ewes, we see Mannheimia hemolytica, and that's, we potentially could have predicted those results. It's really satisfying to see that it is as we thought it might be. In terms of treatment with antibiotics, most of these were treated, showed, as both as Rachel said, the antibiotics were very effective. The majority were treated with, I think this is the next slide,
Next one.
the macrolides, but some with tetracyclines and some penicillin. So in terms of sensitivity, all the Staph aureus were, not all of them, 93% were sensitive to both tetracyclines, oxytetracycline, and the tylosin types. So tylosin is the specific active that we see in a macrolide. Mannheimia hemolytica, we saw a bit more resistance to tetracyclines, but still quite high amounts and fully sensitive to tylosin. The interesting bacteria there is a Streptococcus galactii, which we there are, I think, only 4 cases. Kate will correct me. That we picked up Streptococcus galactii. It's not a common one for mastitis. It is definitely a common bacteria for joint ill. That's where we most often see Streptococcus galactii. And interestingly, all sensitive to the tylosin, but none of those 4 Strep dysgalactia bacteria were sensitive to tetracycline. And we see that, and it's really important for people to bear that in mind. If they've got lambs with joint ill, never treat them with tetracycline. So that's a common finding with the Streptococcus galactii, that it's resistant to tetracycline. So never use Alleamycin oxytetrin for a joint ill case. But yes, so strep is not usually seen in mastitis, but obviously we did pick it up here in a few cases, and it would be interesting to see whether lambs went on to joint ill. We do sometimes see strep shed by the ewes. So this tells us the same thing in a slightly different way, because it's looking at the resistance. So low levels of resistance, and I think this is just what I've said, that some of those Staph aureus were resistant to both tetracyclines and tylosin, and that's reflected in the graph that Rachel showed earlier. Those 7% were resistant to both those types of antibiotic, and a quarter of the Mannheimia resistant to tetracycline. It shows you this, what I've just told you in the last graph, but the other way around. Thanks, Kate.
Okay.
And these were the antibiotics used. So macrolides, so that the names that farmers would know them by: Draxin, Zactran, those long-acting macrolide antibiotics. We don't have to use them, and people will remember using Mycotil for mastitis quite effectively. 70% of these cases were using one of those macrolides, but we also see penicillin being very effectively used for mastitis cases. We actually did a study about 10-15 years ago where we looked at different types of antibiotic, and we showed no difference in effectiveness of the antibiotic used, which surprised us. We were expecting Mycotil to come up as much better. That's not always the case. It's important that you use an antibiotic that the bacteria is not resistant to, but as you can see from Kate's, most of those bacteria are sensitive to most of the antibiotics. This shows me two important things. One is that 83% of those used were given anti-inflammatory or painkiller. I think that's really good news from this group. I don't think that's reflective of the whole sheep farming population. I think there are still a lot of farmers who don't necessarily give a painkiller to a ewe with mastitis. We would recommend it. It's incredibly painful disease, and it's important. The anti-inflammatory and the analgesic, the pain relief for use for mastitis. And the fact that we had most of these cases only treated once would reflect the fact that most of these cases had those long-acting macrolides given to them. The 30% that were treated again were probably the ones given penicillin, and you do need to give a course, repeat the treatment. So I think that's me.
Yeah,
Kate.
thank you, Fiona. That's great. So just to summarise really, and I hope everybody else agrees with my summary, the results are in line with the previous studies. You might remember when I said at the beginning, some of the things that but which bacteria are causing mastitis commonly in ewes, and some of the issues with management. And we've said Staphylococcus aureus and Mannheimia are the most common and typically seen. I don't think we found anywhere close to 37 types of bacteria in these samples, unlike one of those papers I commented on in the beginning, but we found 14, and obviously Rachel found a few more in her set of samples. Most of the bacteria involved were sensitive to the first line antibiotics, the penicillins, which was great news. So maybe we could be reducing the use of macrolides as they're more precious to us than the penicillins perhaps. And really great news that everybody or most people were using an anti-inflammatory because of how important that is to get the ewe moving comfortably again and eating properly, and feeding her lambs, or her lamb, the one she's left with. So really important that from an animal welfare perspective. And obviously, as Fiona's emphasised, the tetracyclines are not effective against strep dysgalactiae. I still have to sort of dig into that and see if those farms that had the strep dysgalactiae cases actually had a fair amount of jointal on the farm too. I just need to talk to those farmers about that. So just to say a few thank yous.
Before you do, Kate, I've just remembered I didn't say about the vaccine.
Oh yes, thank you.
I was meant to. Sorry.
Yeah,
so I'm just going to jump in before you say your thank yous.
Yeah.
So what's Staphylococcus aureus, the one that's over 40% of those samples were Staph aureus, and that's there is a vaccine against Staph aureus mastitis. It's made by Vimco. You can buy it through your vets. You need to give 2 mils into the muscle, both 5 weeks before lambing and 2 weeks before lambing. So it's quite intensive. But what's really important if you're considering vaccinating your ewes against mastitis is that you know it's Staph aureus mastitis that the ewes have. So before you'd even consider vaccination would be taking samples in exactly the way Kate and Rachel have described, taking a sterile sample, getting to the lab, getting a diagnosis, because it would be an incredible waste of money to be vaccinating against one bacteria if predominantly on your farm it was Mannheimia that was causing the problems. So I think that's probably all we need to say about the vaccine.
Can I ask, Fiona, if the farmers in my group, and some of them have identified Staph aureus as the main cause, could they then assume it's going to be the same next year? Because you wouldn't want to be considering the vaccine once you've got a case of mastitis, would you? So
no, it's too late. And so
season.
It's, I mean, you can't guarantee it will be the same next year. So I don't actually have a huge number of people who are using the vaccine. I know Joe Henry, one of the vets, has done some work and shown a cost benefit for farms where they know they've got Staph aureus mastitis. It's sometimes hard to justify it unless you know you're going to get a number of cases. So It's usually for people who've repeatedly having mastitis and they've had diagnostics and stuff, you know, repeatedly, and we know that's a problem in that flock, is ones that would consider vaccinating. But you're absolutely right, Kate. It's pointless to wait until you've got a big problem.
Yes.
It's too late. You've got to be 5 weeks and 3 weeks for lambing.
Exactly. Okay, thanks, Fiona. So just before we take questions, I just want to say some thank yous. I'd really like to say big thank you to the farmers who committed the project, provided samples and all the information they sent in on each case of mastitis, which I know it was a lot of trouble. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank the APHA, Rachel and Liz Nab, who's also on the call, for the lab analysis and help in preparing this presentation, and Farming Connect for funding the project too. So thank you, everybody. That's great. So if we have any questions, we'd be happy to take them. So I don't know if there are any questions yet. Any in the chat? Anybody?
Not yet, Kate. But I was just wondering, you know, from the farmers that took part, have they made any? Will they make any changes for this lambing in regards to like housing? You know, how they, you know, the protocols and stuff. As some highlights come out from the discussion.
I've still got to do some more analysis on some of the data, Menna. So I think I will be writing it up for you, this whole project, case by case, really, I think. So describing what individuals are doing and, you know, homing in on things like the hygiene and things to see if there is anything we can do for particular farms. It's quite tricky because a lot of these cases happen outside. So it's not all about shed management unless those bacteria are taken outside, and then it's a problem. But a lot of these cases are 6-10 weeks after they've given birth, and I suggest it's a completely different environment then. So it's more difficult to manage outside of a shed than it is inside a shed, although you'd expect there to be less of a challenge outside. But given poor weather, cold, wet weather, and, you know, sheep may be sitting under a hedge and, you know, in muddy conditions, I'm sure that makes things a lot worse. So when I analyse each farm individually, I think I may have some, you know, bespoke advice for each farm.
Thanks, Kate. We've had a few questions, and so we've got one asking, was the type of straw used, wheat versus barley, recorded, and the level of mastitis then, you know, was there a difference? But again, would that maybe something you will look into further again, Kate?
I mean,
consider.
I didn't ask that question, but I can, because I've got 12 farmers. I could go back and ask them what sort of straw it was. I think as long as the straw is clean and dry, then I don't think there'd be any difference between wheat and barley. But I think if it was mouldy or damp, then I think you're going to have potentially far more problems. So probably the question I need to ask those farmers, what sort of straw was it, and was it nice and clean and dry and bright? Because as we've all seen mouldy straw and think I'd rather not use that, but maybe that's all I've got. So hopefully it's decent straw.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, isn't it, Kate? So we can feed that into the kind of results and findings. We've got another question. Which bedding would you choose pre-lambing to avoid hard udders at lambing, or anything you would add to the bedding?
Well, I think, you know, quite a lot of people will be using some sort of antibacterial to try to control contamination. And I think the most important thing is keeping everything as dry as possible, rather than letting bedding build up, which creates heat, which actually encourages bacteria to grow. So I think cleaning out individual pens, keeping pens dry, and potentially using some antibacterial. Fiona might like to comment about that too.
Yeah, so some people would put lime underneath the bedding, wouldn't they? I know one of those studies that you quoted earlier, which had risk factors, mastitis with larger numbers of sheep, I don't think they showed any difference in the type of straw. There was something to do with hardcore bedding, or it makes a difference if you can clean out the shed properly, clean it out, let it dry between, and then bed, or whether you've got hardcore soil bedding underneath the straw, but not. There's so many different factors that I don't think you could pin it down to that.
No.
Interesting, some of the work coming out of Liverpool on looking at joint till cases, they found that shavings has come up as definitely making it less of a problem, joint till less of a problem, and people have used shavings rather than straw, which is interesting.
Yeah, I think shavings do have some antibacterial properties anyway, don't they, Fiona? And I
Yeah,
also think
exactly, yeah.
ventilation in sheds is really important, about trying to keep the atmosphere dry as well as the bedding dry. So it's just, yeah, all about keeping a good airflow through the shed and keeping things as dry as possible.
Cool. Another question. Listening to the farmers, it sounded like feed and weather were the main culprits. Would you say that was significant?
I would say this spring the weather had a very big impact, because we all know it was wet and cold most of the time. Although it's interesting to hear Grace say that on hot days she saw a few more cases. So maybe that's just simply higher temperatures encouraging the bacteria to grow. But yeah, I think weather has a very big impact. It certainly did in the Beast from the East year. And what was the other one you said, Menna? It was weather and
Feed.
Feed. Yeah, I think feed is very, very important. I think there is a tendency for us all to be careful with the compound feed, particularly after lambing when there's plenty of grass, and potentially young ewes are very susceptible they're trying to grow as well as produce milk for their lambs. And if we cut off their feed too soon, then I think they are probably much more likely to go down with mastitis, simply because they can't keep up with what the lambs are demanding. So I think maybe it's a special case for yearlings, certainly to be fed better than older ewes, to try, particularly if they're rearing twins. So yeah, certainly I was involved with the work at Warwick University, and I did quite a lot of detailed studies on the nutrition of those flocks that were involved in those studies, and certainly I found a fair number that weren't meeting the nutritional requirements before or after lambing that would be recommended. So some people needed more protein, some people needed more energy. So yeah, I think nutrition is really, really important, and the weather, and I think probably those are the two key things. So if we have our ewes in good condition, that helps to make them more robust to defend themselves against any disease, but also giving them the right amount of protein and energy to milk well, so their lambs aren't hungry and don't start sort of damaging the teats. So yeah, I think.
And that was quite interesting, Kate, that your the ages of the ewes, that you didn't see a lot of mastitis in the younger animals, which other people have found.
No, I think not many people were lambing ewe lambs, so I didn't have many ewe lambs. But Helen said she saw more in yearlings than she did in other sheep. But most people seem to have a bit of a spread, Fiona, across you know, the whole age range. So yeah, and there were some thin ewes in my groups. You know, there was one ewe I remember at 1.5 condition score, which maybe didn't surprise me getting mastitis. She probably didn't have enough milk for her lambs, and that was probably the reason why she managed to get mastitis, because the Mannheimia, I think, is the one that's spread by the lambs suckling. It's coming out from the lamb inside the lamb's mouths, and then the bacteria track up the teat canal. So I think maybe that's what is a good route of entry for the bacteria being spread by lambs. And if lambs are pinching from other ewes, they may be spreading it to another ewe as well. So hungry lambs trying to get milk from another ewe. So that might be potentially a problem too.
And then a question on, did you see any breed infancies? Like, so yeah, initially, Kate, did you find anything?
I have got all the breed information,
Mm.
and I've got I've not quite got 101 breeds, of course I haven't, but I haven't analysed that because I didn't want to send a hair running down that one, Menna, at the moment. I don't want to blame any particular breed.
No.
I think we had them across the piece, okay? I think we had, you know, Grace mentioned Beulah's, Helen mentioned blue-faced Leicesters, Welsh mules, Suffolk mules, we had the whole Texel mules, had a whole range of different breeds. So, you know, it's a tricky one to look at particular breeds. I think it's across the piece. Nobody, I would say, came out as being particularly bad. All right. And of course, I've only got 12 farms that provided, you know, a fair amount of data. And of course, that doesn't cover all the breeds in the country. So I can't pin anything on a particular breed at this point. I will have a further look at it, but I didn't want to, you know, say it's all this breed. Yeah, I would have got in trouble.
Yeah, tread carefully.
Yes.
We've got another question. Was there a genetic connection with certain flocks? Would there be evidence that could be passed from mother to lamb? So when the lamb has her own lamb in time, it persists. So yeah, it was probably too early to say, and maybe not have the links.
I haven't got that information, Menna, but I did ask farmers to tell me whether the ewe was rearing her own lambs or any lambs were fostered on. Yeah. So because I always think fostering on could be a risk factor too. So, you know, that ewe doesn't always take to that fostered lamb particularly well, and then could be causing problems. But no, I haven't got any. But I certainly, when I get together with the farmers who are on the project, which I plan to do after this, do this webinar again specifically for those who haven't been able to join tonight. You know, those are the questions I'll be asking them, Menna. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I will close the meeting there, but as Kate mentioned, this was a discussion group project. These are the kind of initial findings, and Kate's got a lot of work now to troll through all the data. So there will be a kind of final project report, which will be available to read at your own kind of leisure. With everybody that's registered for tonight's webinar, I do have your email addresses, so I will keep that to one side. And when the report's ready, I can always forward it on to you via your emails. So yeah, something to look and watch out for. So yeah, I just want to thank Kate and all the farmers that have been part of this project, and I'm sure everybody agrees it's been a really valuable insight into antibiotic resistance in regards to mastitis. And also thank you for the APHA staff for also being open and helpful with Kate to share information and discuss the project. Also, at the end of this webinar, I'd like to thank Rachel from APHA for her insight into their project results, and also from Helen and Grace, the participating farmers, for sharing their experiences of being part of the project, and also for everybody who's watched and contributed via their questions. As always, please don't hesitate to contact Farming Connect, either via your local Farming Connect development officer or via the central number. We are here to help, and also I urge you to keep an eye on the Farming Connect website for updates, and also the What's On page. And we've got many workshops and meetings up and coming. With just next week, we've got topics covering cover crop farm walk in Ragland. We've got a business workshops in Corwen, calf pneumonia result projects in Wrexham, and milking pala maintenance and efficiency in Carmarthen. So yeah, every different topic there to everybody's delight. But as I said, please keep an eye on the Farming Connect What's On page. We are currently running a roadshow across Wales discussing the control of agri-pollution 2021 regulations. So yeah, if you want more information on that regulation, we have got various events across Wales running at the moment. But as mentioned, there's events added daily onto the What's On page, so please keep an eye. So thank you ever so much. I will bring this webinar now to a close, and when you leave, you will be prompted to complete an evaluation form. So we would really appreciate 2 minutes of your time to provide really valuable feedback for tonight's webinar. But for now, have a lovely evening, and os da I chi gyd.
Thank you, Menna.
Thank you, Menna.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.